Students, what was the biggest teacher meltdown you ever witnessed? Story 1. So I was a few tables away in the cafeteria when a loud outburst caused the entire lunchroom to go silent for about a minute. There were probably 100 kids in this room, and we all looked over to see what the hell just happened. So you know that thing that immature 7th and 8th graders do when some sort of intimate tension builds up between a girl and a boy? Basically, the boy and girl involved were at the same table, popular kids' table, and the boy was eating chicken nuggets with barbecue sauce. The girl, pretty but notoriously slutty, made a stupid lighthearted joke that literally went like this. "Hey, Greg, you can dip me in barbecue sauce if you want." All of a sudden, that joke caused a wave of students yelling to build up. You know the thing where someone goes, "Ooh," then everyone else joins in? Well, the entire 8th grade class blew up in a roar of "ooh" very quickly, even when only 2% of the students heard the actual joke. It's just a funny thing that we all like to join in on, because why the hell not, right? So after about 15 or 30 seconds of the entire lunchroom chanting in unison, this substitute teacher, a relatively new guy whom we all thought was chill, rushed up to the kids who started it. He had a band and would show us YouTube videos in class while making us do minimal work if he had to. I don't know what was going on in his mind or why he chose this method of diffusing the situation, but he picked up one of the standard heavy metal school chairs and straight up Hulk smashed the thing on the table in the effort to make a loud enough noise that would overpower the ooze. Keep in mind, these are round tables, and there were kids seated in every seat huddled around the table shoulder to shoulder. If he had smashed that chair anywhere but dead center in the table, it would have easily knocked into one of the students, which as a teacher in public school is a big no-no. He also made this extremely loud and scary primal grunt as he was doing it, as if he had just lifted a car off a burning pedestrian. Needless to say, we never saw him again, and he was terminated either that day or the morning after. Shame, he was a cool guy sorta. Guess he just had anger issues. Edit, the chairs used are probably 5 to 10 pounds of decently thick stainless steel and iron. That would be like tossing a dumbbell at the upper torsos of 12 students in a circle. Too long didn't read. Substitute teacher in the lunchroom became enraged when trying to diffuse a loud room of chanting 8th graders. Smashes metal chairs onto tables full of kids while screaming unintelligibly. If you are so inclined, go back to the 39-second mark and listen to my flawless impression of Tom from Succession. Let me know what you think. Story 2. I went to school in Germany, and once when we had our history class, the lesson started off really weird. The teacher started dictating to us a math problem, in which you had to calculate what the costs are for treating disabled people and how much the state could save if there weren't any disabled people. Most of us immediately realized that this was one of the propaganda math problems students in the Third Reich had to solve. We were kind of confused, since the Third Reich was not the topic which we were discussing at this moment. Nevertheless, we wrote down the problem and even started calculating when the teacher suddenly snapped. He began to scream at the whole class with an intensity I've not witnessed before about how we as the students should have rejected solving a task like that one, how we were educated to question everything, but still obeyed when he gave us a task which discriminated against disabled people. He was so furious that he left the classroom and only returned after half an hour. We spent the rest of class talking about the dangers that a new movement like the Nazis could arise again in Germany and how we always need to be aware of that. Story 3. 8th grade English. Well, I was a sort of middle school teaching assistant. Basically, each 7th grade teacher picked one 8th grader that they previously had in class, and we used an elective period to sit in and assist with the class. I signed up to the program in hopes of spending an hour a day doing nothing. Plot twist, this teacher apparently acquired some rage issues over the summer. Midway through our second week of class that year, the 7th graders were filing in the room from lunch, chatting and joking around like usual. Mr. R, as we can call him, decided that the room was too loud. He started softly mumbling passive-aggressive crap along the lines of, or will we all be raging toddlers that cannot quiet down? And let's just be as loud as possible. I heard him because I was at his desk, 4 feet away. The kids obviously did not. He continued for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Again, the students were doing nothing out of the ordinary. He suddenly gets red-faced, takes his Caucasian, literature-appreciating bare hand, and slams it down directly on the glass screen portion of the overhead projector. For those who don't remember, projectors had a piece of thick butt glass to write on, placed over a light bulb down underneath. The thing freaking exploded. Glass flew everywhere, and the pressure of the glass and bulb popping sounded like a small bomb went off. Being '03, the class reacted like a terrorist attack just happened, because all they saw after the noise was Mr. R holding up a bloody fist and glass strewn about all over their desks. Teacher just stared at his hand, then at the class, then just bolted out of the room. My brain was like, what the heck is happening? Get out of this room. But I decided to play the role of the orchestra on the Titanic and casually turned on Finding Nemo and shrugged at the 30 bewildered faces of 12-year-olds. Mr. R came back about 5 minutes before class ended and silently sat down at his desk, bloody nub hand wrapped around in gauze and bandages. He didn't say a word, and we never spoke of it again. No idea who cleaned up the shrapnel, but I basically fled the scene with the rest of the class when the bell rang. Nemo found his dad. Edit, sources have brought to my attention that Finding Nemo was in fact released in 2003, making it impossible to show in 2002. I don't believe that my memory of the specific year over a decade ago is incorrect, therefore I may have stumbled upon a rare pre-release of the DVD in that room, placed specifically to entertain distressed youth. Or it was 2003 and not 2002. Either way, I changed it. Story 4. Math class. 3 kids sitting in the first row were constantly talking and disturbing the math teacher. He was trying to solve some complex geometry problem. He was my teacher for the last 2 years, so I had always known him as a really chilled out guy. And the worst punishment he gave was to make the student stand at the back of the class. And that's what he did. He told the guy to go and stand at the back, only that this boy snuck in a piece of chalk with him. A few minutes later, Sir was again engrossed in the problem. The boy punished at the back decides to have some fun and aims the chalk at one of the other first benchers, his partner in crime. Only that it hit Math Sir smack in the head. He turned around, asking very calmly who did it. After 5 minutes of prying everyone, I decided to be a good Samaritan and ratted him out. The boy never talked to me again, although we never did earlier. Math Sir marches to the back of the class and starts thrashing him real bad. The boy was as surprised as I was, and so was the rest of the class. There were several cuts on his chest due to his fingernails, as I saw later. We thought we'd never see our math teacher again. As if. Next day we had a surprise calculus test, and he whooped our butts. As if. Story 5. Had a sub in 5th grade. I was a really unorganized kid, and having to dig through my desk for stuff wasn't uncommon. Sub went to collect our homework one by one, and I was still digging through, pulling a bunch of stuff out when she got to me. She got all towering and told me this was unacceptable. Dumped my desk in front of me and told me I was staying in from recess to organize it. One girl said, "You can't make him do that," and the sub raised her voice and spit out, "You don't tell me what to do, brat. I can do whatever I want." The whole class revolted, and a neighboring teacher came in to see what was up. The sub claimed I was being lippy, and this was my punishment. Then the whole class spoke up and informed him of what really happened, and we were all let out for recess. Came back in, and a lunch lady was sitting at the teacher's desk instead. As the kid who was always picked on by everyone, it was nice to see the whole class stand up for me that day. Story 6. A university professor, actually. She would teach and constantly complain about 3 girls who sat near the back for talking and being on their phone. One day she made a big scene, took down their names, and left dramatically. This was a huge lecture hall of over 100 students. I heard them laughing once, but never anything else. I found her fixation on these 3 intolerable. During the exam, the rooms were organized, what seemed to me as horribly, by last names, not alphabetically, random last letters in different groups. She had seated the 3 in the same room and loudly spoke during the exam for a few minutes to distract them, except there were over 40 people in the room. I'm still bitter because it really distracted me. Story 7. In my elementary school, there was this one super obnoxious kid named Lance who was constantly goofing off and all of that. Though in all honesty, he probably had ADHD without a good support system. Most of our teachers were used to dealing with him, but one day we had this substitute named Mrs. Blake who had no idea what to do with him and all of our class. He's mouthing off every other moment and jumping around like crazy when she starts to boil over and yells at Lance to sit down, which he does. He then calls her a witch or something under his breath, and she finished her transformation into a boiling tomato. She yells, "What the heck do you think you're doing?" which blew our little elementary school minds, and then very violently shook his desk. The thing was, Lance had a blood condition that made him bruise very easily and very dramatically. Then, when she shook his desk, he started crying, understandably, because he was getting these massive purple-black bruises all over his legs. She was banned from our school after that. Story 8. After our class picture, our first-year teacher declared, "New rule, every day is now class picture day. I want to see smiles from each and every one of you every single day." The class let out a collective groan, and the teacher said, "Come on, turn those frowns upside down." She kept at us for a good month on the smile policy. Keep in mind this was during the 90s. The class was divided evenly amongst goths, grunge, and gangstas. The only thing we agreed upon were that smiles were for pussies. The meltdown came the day she brought in a karaoke machine and attempted to sing Tim McGraw's "Just to See You Smile." We just sat there stone-faced, as usual, then she tried to ham it up just to get us to laugh. But nothing. We were all too tough to show any humor or heart. And then she broke down and started blubbering. "I just wanted a smile. Is that too much to ask?" Apparently it was, because none of us even had the goddamn common courtesy to offer her a tissue. Next day, she went resting witch face on our butts, and word on the street is she hasn't cracked a smile in 20 years. Story 9. Maybe not a meltdown per se, but I had a chemistry class that was held in a huge auditorium with really steep stairs. The professor always walked all around the room while we took quizzes and tests. One day, he tripped halfway up the auditorium stairs and took a hell of a fall. He landed face down, unhurt apart from bruises, on the floor, and before we could really react, he started banging his fists on the floor and screaming, "Entropy! Entropy! Entropy!" Story 10. It started as a normal lesson, with the teacher giving the class a lecture. Then his phone rang, which happens really rarely, but instead of hanging up like he would usually do, he answered. When he hung up, he had the most distraught face I've ever seen and stayed silent for close to a minute. "I'm sorry, a friend just committed seppuku," he said before sobbing quietly and excusing himself out of the classroom. Story 11. In high school, our government teacher freaked out on my class. We had a few talkers in the back corner, but they finally broke him. He flipped his podium lectern over and started screaming at us. He called us the worst group of kids he'd ever had to teach, and that he was 110% accurate that we were going to be nothing. Then he went to his desk and drank his entire thermos of coffee. A few years later, he was having a retirement party at his house. I was close friends with his son, and he revealed that the thermos was 80% vodka and 20% coffee. That sounds like the grossest drink ever. I don't care for vodka or coffee, so putting them together, blah. Story 12. Year 9 math class. Our teacher was sick, and an early 20s substitute teacher came in to cover. She was lovely, kind, friendly, although a bit timid and shy. One girl in our class used a fountain pen to flick ink on a skirt she was wearing one day. Poor woman noticed her doing it, didn't say a word, and just went to her desk, put her head in her hands, and sobbed, and didn't move for at least 10 minutes. Eventually, a friend of mine goes to get another teacher. The sub was escorted out, still crying, and was seen for the rest of the day just crying in her car, not moving for another 4 or so hours. Story 13. Junior year in my university, my genetics professor was in the middle of a lecture when authorities took him out of the auditorium, thank goodness, and informed him that his wife, the dean of our college, had been struck and killed by a motor vehicle that morning. He retreated to his office and proceeded to tear the place apart like a tornado had gone through it. He ripped the top of his desk off its frame, pulled down all of his bookcases, books, pages, papers, all sorts of documents, and furniture strewn everywhere in pieces. By the time I graduated, he still wasn't the same man as he was before that awful day. Story 14. We had an art teacher in year 7, 11 years old, who would lock himself in the supply cupboards and scream and rip his hair out. Story 15. In high school, I turned in a form to my science teacher a day late. She screamed at me, walked out the classroom, and was gone for nearly an hour. Class had started, and everyone had speculations, blaming me for what happened. Teacher comes back, joyful and smiling, and says she just needed a walk around the campus to recover. Story 16. I had a Spanish teacher in middle school that was so tired of us turning in broken Spanish on our homework assignments that she screamed at us and called us stupid Americans before throwing pieces of chalk at us one after the other. Another time she got on her knees and started praying the rosary in front of us when a girl said, "El pollo nugget." Story 17. I was in a band. One day, one of the regulars, always on a babadoo-ba-zee-boo-boo-ba-da-boo-da-da-da. See, you can tell I'm in a band, huh? One day, one of the regular, always in trouble, disruptive students was being extra disruptive while the director was trying to tell us something important. So after about 5 different times of going the normal route to get him to settle down, he cracked. It got quiet, and then the director bellowed, "Student's name, are you stupid or just don't give a crap?" The whole room went quiet. All eyes were now on the disruptive kid, who was then trying to hide behind his tuba. Then the director continued with his announcement like nothing happened. I'll just add that a butt tuba backwards is a butt tuba. Story 18. We had a physical education teacher who would always sweat like a mofo whenever anatomical subjects were raised. He ended up having to be a substitute teacher for one of our anatomical education lessons. We were very aware of his discomfort discussing the subject and asked him lots of in-depth questions, making sure we used all the correct anatomical terminology. The guy had a Class A anxiety attack. Pity no one had taught us about those, and I was genuinely afraid he was going to have a heart attack. Red face, profuse sweating, mom spaghetti, breathing difficulty, and a look of primal terror in his eyes. We got the early mark we were fishing for, but I think we did the poor fellow some real emotional damage. Story 19. This was in high school. We had a band teacher. His name was Pinky because he had very red hair and pale skin with a red tint. Borderline albino. Every time he got mad, his entire face turned tomato red. I don't remember the sequence of events, but he was already frustrated. Everyone in the room knew to shut up so that we didn't tick him off any further. Well, everyone except this one dippy girl. She asked something along the lines of, "Are you mad?" and kept pestering him. He finally snapped. His face turned that familiar shade of tomato red, and he threw the pencil he was using to conduct across the room. He then stormed out and slammed the door hard enough that it could be heard on the other side of the building. He quit soon after. Story 20. Not so much a breakdown, but a break in normal behavior for sure. Our freshman English teacher was a small, soft-spoken woman who was kind of known to be a teacher you could walk all over with little but no repercussions. We were in a review session after school, and some upperclassmen were just hanging out in the hallways, making lots of noise, so she was constantly poking her head out in the hall, asking them to be quiet. As we were all very silent, reading or something, the classroom door absolutely slams shut. So hard the latch didn't have time to catch, and the door bounced back open. The teacher immediately yells, "Oh, hell no!" kicks off her heels and takes off out the door. She caught up with the kid, who had taken a running start, and kicked the door shut, and berated him for a good 10 minutes, which we could hear clear as day from the end of the hall. It was like nothing we'd ever heard from her. Story 21. 10th grade was in math class, and the teacher was getting frustrated that not everyone was understanding a problem, and he made various threats on what he would do if we didn't figure it out. More homework tests, etc. I kept asking questions because I legitimately didn't understand, and he yelled, "For Pete's sake!" and threw an eraser at me. I got up and left. Never ratted him out, and the next day he was super patient with everyone. It was his, I messed up moment. Story 22. My super dorky history teacher in 8th grade was the nicest teacher I've ever met, but there were a couple class clowns in our class, and he usually dealt with them okay. One day, though, they were obnoxious to the entire class from the moment he walked in, and he snapped, yelling and chucking his stapler across the room. He nailed the staple right into Ben Franklin's forehead. He immediately apologized and went about his day normally, while all the students went silent. Nobody ever bothered him again after that day. Story 23. I taught public high school for 7 years and have been teaching in a university ever since. Every time one of these threads pops up, I expect to find the story of how I once broke down in tears when a cell phone rang in class, or the time I threw up in a trash can, brushed my teeth with bottled water right in front of all 42 of them, asked a janitor to come down and take the trash out, and went back to teaching after my favorite student of all time faked barfing noises because he knew it would make me puke. Story 24. In elementary school, the cool thing to do was put hand sanitizer in excess on your hand and sniff it, pretending to get really high. Things escalated to the point of our teacher, at full volume, yelling, "Where is the hand sanitizer?" A brave soul returned it, and the teacher threw it against the wall. Story 25. I had a history teacher in high school. For context, this was in about 1980. To this day, I can't quite recall what prompted this, but he stood in front of the entire class, shaking with rage, and said, "I am a homosexual." We were all just dumbfounded. Not that he was gay, I think most of us had figured that out already, but that he felt obligated to make that announcement. Story 26. We had an art teacher who had one glass eye. A student who had a reputation for being a butthole from a whole family of buttholes, his sister beat me up in infant school, unwisely decided to stick his head around the door to the art room and yell, in a voice that could shatter glass, "Oi, Harris, you one-eyed jack!" This didn't go down at all well with Mr. Harris, who terrified most kids. Cue manic Welsh art teacher chasing students all over the playing fields with a tent spike. The whole class was looking out the window following the chase. All it needed was yakety sax playing as a soundtrack, or the Benny Hill theme song. Story 27. 8th grade math teacher. He was well known for his short temper, but this particular day was bad. There was a kid in my class, Justin, that never listened and never did his homework. One day, the math teacher just had it with Justin, grabbed his desk with him in it, and picked it up and slammed it back down on the ground a few times. After that, he shoved the desk with Justin in it across the room. Justin was fine, thankfully. Math teacher just stormed out. Told my mom, and I guess a few other parents called the school about it too. He was gone for a few weeks and had to take anger management classes. I just went by my old middle school a few weeks ago, and he's the assistant principal now. Who would have expected that? Story 28. In high school, they would do trivia questions after the announcement sometimes, and the first teacher who dialed the office with the correct answer would get a prize for the class. My math teacher really wanted to win, and hadn't yet this year. So one fateful morning, the question went out, and we had the answer. So he called it in, but we were the second caller. In a fit of pseudo-rage, he yells, "Dang it!" and kicks this little plastic trash can across the room, where it bonks a kid right in the head. His eyes go wide, and he apologizes and asks if the kid is okay, which he is. Everyone got a good laugh afterwards, including the kid who got hit, and later we would pretend to duck whenever we didn't win the morning trivia contests. Dang it, Bobby. Story 29. I had a 10th grade history teacher who was very much pregnant at the time. We all walked into class one day and she was slumped over her desk, sobbing. Since we were all awkward teenagers and nobody particularly liked this teacher to begin with, we spent all day there awkwardly for a good 15 minutes in silence while she tried to pull herself together. For the remainder of the period, she forced us to play baby shower games. Story 30. Not so much a meltdown as an extremely out-of-character movement. Econ teacher is an older African man whose nose and hairstyle, sides only, no top, makes him look like an old koala. One kid thought it would be a bright idea to throw a lit firecracker under his desk. Said teacher jumped up with a start, performing a charging roll out the classroom door like a cog from Gears of War. He bolted all the way down the hall to the principal's office for backup. Didn't think he was capable of that kind of speed. Story 31. Former student checking in. It was triggered by every single student getting an F on her take-home, multiple question, open book exam. She went on a 15-minute rant about how we weren't taking her class seriously, how this was her passion, and that if we didn't have interest, we could get the hell out of her room, and that she'd be reissuing the same exam, same questions, in class the next day. Anyone that got less than a 90% would be dropped immediately, no questions asked. The next day came around, and she had given her TA the wrong key. The average score was 88%, give or take. Story 32. I had a computer science teacher in grade 10 who was a grade A butthole and completely incompetent. A friend and I discovered he had recently lost a fair bit of money in the stock market and consequently had been left by his wife. Incognito mode wasn't a thing back then. We honestly could have been way worse about this, but didn't ever bring up his wife or tell anyone what we had discovered. What we did do, though, is have a lengthy and audible conversation about the market every morning. How's the TX doing this morning? Down another 40 points, stuff like that. We keep this up for 2 weeks, and he eventually snaps and starts screaming in the middle of class. Ended up taking the rest of the year off. Story 33. I had a history teacher in high school who was always stern and serious, which was great since it gave a reverence to what he was teaching about, and his unpretentious nature meant he spoke about what was important and interesting. One day, however, his voice broke, and after he cleared his throat, it broke again. He stopped talking, put his hands in his pockets, frowned, and took a few breaths. Students, sorry about this lecture. My wife and I just decided to get a divorce. He blankly stared ahead for a second and then walked toward the door, loosening his tie. I need a drink. He exited the door. After a second, he poked his head back in. Of water? I'm coming back. Don't think I've forgotten about Napoleon. Not too much of a meltdown, but he was a pretty manly dude in a nerdy sort of way. Story 34. In primary school, some kids were misbehaving, and she broke down into tears, started screaming, and threw a chair. We never saw her again. Story 35. I don't know if it really counts, but our former Latin teacher once slapped a kid across the face because the kid made fun of her dead husband. She got suspended shortly afterwards. Edit, the teacher got suspended, not the student.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.